Well, I have to mention that I did not grow up in Detroit. The Hudson family spread around the country, and the founder of the business, J.L. Hudson, had three brothers and three sisters. He was very wise with a large family. He sent his brothers off to run businesses in other cities. So my grandfather went to St. Paul and opened a Hudson store there, and then later moved to Buffalo. That's where I grew up. And I first came to Detroit in 1950 on the steamship coming in up the river. And I looked up, and there was a tower that had Hudson's on it. I said to my father, I said, my heavens, I didn't know we had a tower over here. So I actually didn't come to Detroit to work until after I graduated from college in 1953. Spent a year here working at Hudson's, trying to decide whether this city and that company was where I wanted to work. And my wife and I both enjoyed Detroit, and there was a great opportunity. And that was after 2 years in the service in Germany. 1956 was really when we started. Detroit was a city that had a lot of growth. Obviously, it had a lot of problems. But to me, as a young person in 1956, there was nothing but a good future. Our business was going well again. We'd suffered during the Depression of the 30s, and we had very good success, obviously, as most people did in the business during the war years. But then it became a city of a couple different sides. In the late 1950s, they talked about it in the newspapers, Michigan on the rocks, which as a young fellow sort of jolted me a bit. I wasn't expecting or looking forward to that. But the company had grown under the name of Weber. The Webers were nephews of J.L. Hudson, and they're the ones that built the store to the block-wide, 24 stories tall building. And during that period, they followed J.L. Hudson's interest not only in retailing, running the store, but also in the community. And they were very much involved individually, and they saw to it that they made financial contributions to the city. And when I heard about Michigan on the Rocks, it was obvious that I was going to get involved from that part of the company as well. So I was asked to participate in lots of activities that were taking place. And but our business was back going again in the 1960s. We opened up several shopping centers in that period, and it was a shock to me and to our company when in 1967 we had the riots. A very difficult period, but I had already been involved in the community to a degree, and I expected that probably I'd be part of the group that'd be called upon to participate after the riots. The children, when they come and visit us, and the grandchildren, of course, can't expect and don't expect a quick answer, but they're very curious. They want to drive around the community. They want to see the way it exists today. They want to hear how it had existed before. They are happily very excited to see the riverfront now available and active with people, and to drive around Belle Isle and see the prospects there. And they also are well aware of the suburbs, where there is attractive communities. There are schools that are effective, and they're appalled when they compare that to what they see in the city of Detroit, where we have a really totally unsatisfactory public school system. And we don't seem to be able to find answers to that easily. And we have to focus on that. And there's a lot of focus right now. But this is a state of Michigan need in terms of the financing. And we have to, as a community, mind our manners and keep our thoughts going straight ahead and stop all of these peripheral sideshows that make it difficult to get the state of Michigan to help us. The summer of 1967 had been a very warm summer. And the last weekend of the month, particularly warm, and a bar that should have closed earlier stayed open later than it should have, and people were frequenting that, and it just was ignited. There didn't seem to be any one event that caused this disturbance, but the heat, the problems with the community, perhaps police community relations, allowed an incident to get out of hand. And Detroit is a city that spreads out very widely. It's not as densely populated as some communities. And once the light got going on the fire, the problem spread throughout the city of Detroit. Before this, there were problems, obviously. The jobs were not as prevalent as people thought. Education was poor. There were police community relations challenges and problems. So the whole lifestyle of the city and the suburbs were quite well off. The city of Detroit had many challenges and problems, and it just all ignited into a 3-day event. The state police were called out, the National Guard were called out, and quite quickly the federal government called in part of a division that we flown in to help control the population. And it took at least the better part of a week to settle things down, and it's taken now almost 50 years to get the city back in operating situation. There's been a lot of progress, but it took a long time and a lot of cooperation on the part of all the citizens of Detroit and the metropolitan area to bring positive returns again. Well, race was certainly a part of the riot, and Detroit had had a previous race riot back in 1943, I think it was 43, near Belle Isle. And race is a challenge in all the major cities of the United States. Unfortunately, there has been Ferguson and outside of St. Louis, and you have Baltimore, and there are incidents all over. And Detroit is not any worse off than most of these other cities. In many ways, it has addressed the problems more effectively. There are great efforts underway in the neighborhoods to clean up the blight, get the playgrounds reoriented, get the population to stay in the city. But after such a riot, there was a long period of time where people fled the city to the suburbs, particularly people who had children and who needed education to leave the city. And we're just reaching the point where that is beginning to be halted and population moving back into the city. Midtown, it's taken us about 15 or 20 years to get that thing going in a constructive way. There's 98% housing occupancy in Midtown, same in downtown. The revitalization of businesses moving back into the city, construction. You can tell by the number of new restaurants that are opening all of the time throughout the Detroit area that people are gaining more confidence and coming into downtown and Midtown and going to these restaurants. So we're moving forward, but there's still a lot of challenges. The neighborhoods need more of our attention. We need to improve the environment for physically living, to attract people to come in and live in those communities. A lot of work still to be done. As I said, it was a warm night. All our windows were open. We live in Grosse Pointe. And during the night, we began to hear gunfire. So it was obvious that there was a serious situation. And the same thing happened the next night, Sunday night. And so it was clear that there was a problem in the city. And our family were all home. Sunday evening, I arranged for Monday morning that our management team would get together in the downtown store to discuss what we should do, what we needed to do to protect our properties. You can imagine a downtown store with probably about 15 entrances to it, and all show windows and the like was a great concern to us. But we also discussed what we might be able to do in terms of employment practices and the efforts to help the community go on. And it was during this meeting of our management team, knock on the door, my secretary came in and said, the governor wants to talk with you on the telephone. So that was the first formal way that I got involved. The governor said, the public sector has been discredited. We have this serious situation in town. There doesn't seem to be a clear path of what we need to do. We would like you to chair a committee to wrestle with what the challenges are and try to find some solutions and move them forward. But it's your committee to decide how you're going to do that, so that quickly the situation moved to the committee that I was asked to chair. And I hadn't gotten back into the meeting of our management team more in about 5 minutes, and the secretary came back, knocked on the door and said, Mayor Kavanaugh would like to talk with you. So I had the invitation from the governor and the mayor, and we got terrific support, but we never were told what we should be doing or how we could do it. I called together some of the people that I'd known in the community, black and white, to see what kind of a committee we could put together. And I'd had particularly close relationships with a number of the black community who had worked on civic and activities, and they were very helpful. Judge Keith was one of the very helpful people. Arthur Johnson was another. And in about 2 days, we put together a committee that ended up being 39 people that represented life in Detroit. There were 3 very young teenage people that had been active on the streets, activists in the community. They didn't speak the same language as a lot of the rest of us. There was a lot of 4-letter words that indicated what they thought needed to be done and everything. And when I'd invited and brought together a number of CEOs personally, not assistants of their organizations, but them personally. And we held meetings once a month for an entire morning. And they were fabulous meetings. It's probably too bad that we didn't have them all on this tape for this event, because the language, as I said, was pretty open. And a number of my fellow CEOs never had an experience of working with people on that kind of a basis. But it got us focused quickly. And what we did, we drafted significant individual staff resources of these businesses to come on the New Detroit Committee, and we rented some space in one of the office buildings, and we had police community relationships, and we had jobs and employment, and we had race relationships, and we had housing committees. And these groups weren't trained to work in these fields, but they got right down to brass tacks and brought forward programs in writing, and we moved and had lots of meetings with community groups to try and emphasize ideas. And this went on for the entire first year basis, where I think we helped the community settle down. We were constantly being reported in the press, sometimes by people who were quite negative. Not the press wasn't negative, but negative as to what this organization of more whites than blacks, more people of means than not, what they could do and might do. And there were lots of community confrontations from that point of view. But that helped in the airing process to identify from all of the community of Greater Detroit as to what the challenges were, and to give us opportunities to address solutions. We had a couple of people, well, we had a number of people that lived in the suburbs that were on the committee, but we had the chairman of the Oakland County Commission. So we had some participation from the suburbs, the metropolitan area, which was critically important because the resources that we needed to bring to bear and votes on certain issues that were out in the counties and issues that were statewide issues needed to have full support. So we started with nothing. We didn't have a charter. We scratched our way along, and I think that we served a purpose that lasted. There still is a new Detroit, but it isn't the new Detroit that we had of that sense of urgency. But I think for the first 10, 15 years or so, after the riots, New Detroit made a constructive effort for the community. It was gratifying, but to be perfectly honest and open, the challenges today are almost similar to the challenges were at that point. It's just a question of dimension. So the county educational system that's developed, let me take a break there what's the schools, the Wayne County Community College, Macomb County Community College, the community college system really began to grow and blossom out of that. That was one of our successes. I think we had an impact on the City of Detroit Police Department, who underwent significant changes in management and organization. Earlier, there'd been things like stop and frisk, which had been a real violation of individual rights, and that was, of course, already been stopped. The work that went on in corporations to develop new hiring standards and new educational programs to develop people with the capability of having significant jobs was significant. Focus Hope was not part of New Detroit, but it came along in the same time frame, and that had a significant effect in employment areas. And I think particularly the one thing that still lasts today was the significant understanding on the part of the 4 million plus individuals living in the region that they had a significant opportunity and obligation to play some part in strengthening the community and righting the problems that led up to the riot period. There's a timeline in everything, and if you were a teenager at the time, you would be vividly aware of what you went through and what the community went through the destruction of property, the long period of time before things were cleaned up and moved forward again. If you were 50 and in a management position to do it, I would think the rest of your career, you recognize that there were deeper responsibilities and opportunities in your business, in your life, in your professional activity to play a role to keep the community healthy. If you were in your retired years, many had a difficult time identifying what happened in their later years, their 60s and 70s, versus what the community had been. And I think they may not have, here now we're decades later, many of them able to identify to stay in the city, to leave the city, and then be negative about the city that they had to leave. So there are all sorts of differing opinions from that. What we need to recognize is that almost 50 years ago is a long time for a broad level of the population to remember what happened, to have a clear understanding, approved understanding of what happened and why, and what constructively happened afterwards. Very difficult for people who are now teenagers to know that. So fortunately, there is an activity that's taking place, being planned right now, to have under the Detroit Historical Society, the museum, to develop a exhibition that's going to document these stages so that as an educational institution, there'll be the opportunity for schools, for family groups, to revisit what happened 50 years ago on a constructive basis. Some people, when they heard about this possibility, would say to me, why would you revisit something 50 years ago that was so damaging and the like? And my feeling is that we need to know what our history has been to be able to deal with it more effectively going forward. So I'm greatly encouraged that the Historical Society is leading an initiative to put together an exhibition, and they're the perfect party to do it. Many of the problems continue to this day. There is still a high unemployment level throughout the city of Detroit. In the last several decades, there may not have been enough educational programs, job training, to make people in an advanced state to be accepted into new kinds of jobs. The economy is changing. We're much more of a technological economy than we were 50 years ago. And so the need for education, for the intellectual power to manage some of the jobs available is very pressing in the community. Fortunately, the community colleges have been very helpful in doing that. And there are programs in company after company. But we still need to make more effort there. The terrific success of Midtown and its growth shows what can be done when you get the sectors that are really the anchors of that institution get together. You have the Henry Ford Hospital, you have the Detroit Medical Center, you have Wayne State University, all as anchors, not only educationally, but in terms of residential. And then we had foundation support. Our family foundation, the Hudson Wilbur Foundation, has been very forward in identifying ways to stimulate more growth of residential availability of apartments, of cleaning up the communities, go for community parks, and the result of it is there. But now we have to move on to Corktown. We have to move on to North west of Detroit. We have to move on to southwest of Detroit. And it's going to be a continuing big job. And once you get there, you're never there permanently because people are born, they educate, they die, and you have to have a vibrant community that goes on for forever. So the name of the game is going to be to be educated to know what can happen when you're not running a city with integrity, when you're not looking at all of the population and bringing more culture. That's one of the great successes of the recent time of Detroit, is our whole cultural community is expanded and bringing opportunities and is taking events out to the suburbs and around to show that the culture of a symphony or of a museum isn't just on Woodward Avenue, but it's important for everybody's education throughout the community. Yesterday I was driving along on Mother's Day taking a grandchild out to Cranbrook, and I could hardly get by the Detroit Zoo. I mean, the thing was a zoo, actually, on the freeways trying to get off, trying to get into the zoo. So that shows the integration we are as a community, that it's not just in the city of Detroit, but it's through every part of the community and the events. And it's stimulating to see how the suburbs are accommodating and having things, and the people of the city of Detroit, the traffic going north on Woodward Avenue was just as backed up as the people coming west on 696 from the east side of the metropolitan area. But we have a lot of work to do. Governor Romney, I had come to know before he ran for office. He was a man who very much believed in his community. He had led a committee and a drive that ultimately ended up by approving $2 million, how about $2 billion was approved, I believe I have the figure correct, to revitalize physically the Detroit public schools that had gotten deplorable condition. And he got that vote passed, and there were other activities, but he also was a dynamic business person. He didn't have a major corporation to work with, but he took the size of the corporation he had and revitalized it. And he became active in politics, and there was the whole matter of the state's charter, and that was a major drive that he led, supported by others, and then ended up by running for governor. He, I think, properly realized that under the tragedy of the riot, that the private sector needed to come forward with their resources, their energy, and be committed. And I consider it to be a personal good fortune that I had the opportunity to be called upon by him. He gave all the support that one might want, but not many ideas of what to do or why to do it, or trying to reroute the ideas. He left us alone to work on it. Mayor Kavanaugh had been a public figure and was mayor, and he was left with a challenging problem. The population that he had was a total of violation of all rules and regulations and things, had erupted on him immediately, and for years afterwards the population was moving out of Detroit, and he had an extremely difficult role. But he was a man of deep honor from my point of view. I had an excellent relationship with him. I'd known him before, and we got good support. And I'll mention a third party, because there was a triumvirate of public sector. and that was the Assistant Secretary or Deputy Secretary of Defense. And now I have to take a time out while I restart my battery, because it was Cyrus Vance. So you can cut it in as you want, or you can eliminate it. But President Johnson, in deciding that he had to take a national stance on this riot, and there was a unrest, sending in troops, he asked the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Cyrus Vance, to come to Detroit. And he was here for a full week at the beginning and more time later, and helped focus what resources the federal government could provide, not only to place safety, but other programs that they could adapt. And interestingly, he had a terrible back pain, and he slept at City Hall on the floor in that period. So I think the federal government did a remarkable job of identifying opportunities, and our New Detroit Committee took advantage by loading people up on an airplane and going up to Lansing to lobby for certain things on the housing situation, and going down to Washington to meet with the representatives and the major committees to lobby for support. So they were all people that had put their back to the wheel as the public sector, but using, and not just New Detroit Committee, they were using church groups and other activities, labor unions, to identify programs that helped us out of that period. New Detroit came without any predecessor organization, any toolkit, any resource, any book to track through. We had to come up on our own. The New Detroit Committee was appointed by the chair and people that I consulted with in the community throughout the city, and some suburban people. There are 39 individuals. They met monthly. They quickly volunteered staff of their organizations to come in. We rented space for it. We had an individual by the name of Kent Mathewson, who had become, been his career in many parts of the country in terms of bringing together public and private people. And we divided up as we more and more found the need, police community relations, housing, employment, education, etc. We had, I think, about 9 committees. And they make reports every month when the committee met. We had excellent attendance. We had chief executive officers. We had 3 individuals who were teenage activists in the community. People questioned me when I put that one forward, but it worked out beautifully because they spoke a different language, and we'd go around the table and everybody introduced themselves, and then they quickly found out that there was a resource there, a living resource from the street, that were talking a different perspective, and it gave us a blend. We had the chairman of the Oakland County Commission. So there became some regional input as well as through Detroit. There were people like federal judge Damon Keith, before he was named to the court. It was very helpful. A close friend and very insightful, and Arthur Johnson, who was a very well-respected, but an activist that always knew how to lean forward and put the language together to get people to understand that. So we had a melting pot. We had some community activists. We're just private citizens, never been in an organization before, and they had a different way of taking up time to get us focused on the issues. It was quite an experience, and I personally value it in my own life as something that gave me a lot of good insight. And I enjoy looking back on it.